I was sitting in my own living room holding the heavy gold pen that was about to sign away my $42 million life's work to my only son. My daughter-in-law, smiling her sweetest, most innocent smile, handed me my usual black coffee to celebrate the moment. But just as the dark liquid neared my lips, my housekeeper of 25 years brushed past my shoulder and whispered 3 words that made my blood run instantly cold. "Do not drink it. Trust me." I had exactly 3 seconds to decide if my mind was playing tricks on me, or if my own flesh and blood had just set a lethal trap. If you are watching this, hit the subscribe button and let me know in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is there. I need to know you are with me on this because the betrayal I am about to uncover will leave you absolutely speechless. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked each second, feeling heavier than the last. I am Harrison Cole, 72 years old, and for the last 4 decades I have breathed, bled, and practically killed myself to build coal freight from a single broken-down used truck into a logistics empire. $42 million. That is the number printed on the valuation reports stacked neatly in front of me on my custom mahogany coffee table. Across from me sat my son Derek, 38 years old, wearing a $3,000 Italian suit that I had indirectly paid for. He was bouncing his knee, a nervous habit he has had since he was a little boy. But today it did not look like the innocent nerves of a boy taking over his father's legacy. It looked like greed. It looked like a man who could not wait for the ink to dry so he could finally get his hands on the vault. Sitting next to him was Richard Lawson, my estate lawyer for the past 15 years. Richard was smoothing out the crisp white pages of the succession contract, his face a mask of practiced professionalism. "Just your signature on the bottom line, Harrison, and the transition of power will be complete," Richard said, his voice smooth and reassuring. I looked down at the pen in my hand. Then I looked at my hand itself. Even after years sitting in the chief executive chair, my knuckles are still thick, the skin permanently roughened. There is a faded white scar across the back of my left hand from a blown tire on a freezing highway outside of Chicago 30 years ago. I remember the biting wind. I remember the smell of diesel and burned rubber. I remember staying awake for 48 hours straight just to make a delivery on time so I could pay the mortgage and put food on the table for my late wife Evelyn and our boy. I glanced back up at Derek. His hands rested on his knees. They were soft, perfectly manicured. The hands of a man who had never changed a tire in the rain, never stayed up all night worrying about payroll, never sacrificed a single comfort to build something from the dirt up. I was giving him my entire life's work on a silver platter, hoping it would finally make him a man. "Here you go, Dad," a soft voice chimed in. It was Monica, my daughter-in-law. She stepped gracefully around the heavy leather sofa, holding a steaming ceramic mug. 34 years old, always dressed flawlessly, with a smile that never quite reached her cold, calculating eyes. She handed me the coffee. Black, no sugar, just the way I have taken it every morning for 50 years. "I brewed it fresh for you," she said, her voice dripping with honey. "A special blend to celebrate a very special day. You have earned your retirement, Harrison. It is time to let Derek carry the heavy load." I took the mug. The porcelain was warm against my scarred palms. The rich, dark aroma of the coffee drifted up, masking whatever else might be in the room. I smiled back at her, a genuine fatherly smile, and brought the cup toward my face. That was when Elena walked into the room. Elena is 60 years old, a proud, hard-working woman who has been our housekeeper for 25 years. When Evelyn died 5 years ago, Elena was the one who kept this house from falling apart. She knows every creak in the floorboards, every shadow in the halls, and she practically raised Derek when I was out on the road. According to Derek's strict instructions for today, Elena was supposed to stay out of the living room during the official meeting. But here she was, holding a microfiber cloth, stepping quietly behind my heavy armchair. She leaned over, pretending to wipe a non-existent smudge off the edge of the glass side table next to me. As she leaned in, the side of her face came inches from my ear. "Do not drink it," she whispered. Her voice was barely a breath, trembling with a raw, terrifying urgency. "Trust me." She immediately straightened up, turned, and walked out of the room without making eye contact with anyone. My hand stopped in midair. The rim of the coffee mug was exactly 1 inch from my lips. The air in the room suddenly felt incredibly thin. Every instinct I had developed out on the dangerous highways, every survival mechanism that had kept me alive in cutthroat business deals screamed at me. Elena was not a dramatic woman. She did not play games. If she risked her job and Derek's wrath to whisper that warning, she meant it with her life. I slowly lowered the mug back to my lap, resting it on my knee. "Is everything all right, Dad?" Derek asked, his bouncing knee abruptly stopping. He leaned forward, his eyes darting from my face to the coffee cup and back again. "Just taking a moment, son," I said, my voice steady, though my heart was beginning to hammer against my ribs. "Just taking in the weight of 40 years of work." I looked at Monica. She was standing perfectly still, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Her sweet smile was still pasted on her face, but her eyes were fixed intently on the mug in my hand. She was waiting for me to take a sip. They were both waiting. I needed a distraction. I needed to see what would happen if I did not drink it. And more importantly, I needed to know exactly what was in this cup. But I could not accuse them outright. If I was wrong, I would destroy my family forever. If I was right, I was sitting in a room with 2 people who wanted to eliminate me. I had to make a move. Fast. I looked at the documents again. Richard tapped his pen against the table, a subtle push for me to hurry up. "Take your time, Harrison, but the notary is waiting outside." The notary. Everything was perfectly arranged. The trap was set. But I am not a man who gets backed into a corner easily. I survived blizzards in the Rockies and freight strikes in the 90s. I am not going down in my own living room over a cup of coffee. I adjusted my grip on the heavy stack of financial folders resting on the arm of my chair. With a deliberate, calculated flick of my wrist, I pushed the entire stack over the edge. Dozens of papers, valuation reports, and tax documents cascaded onto the expensive Persian rug, scattering in every direction. "Oh, damn my clumsy hands," I muttered, acting the part of the tired old man they thought I was. "I will get it, I will get it," Derek said quickly, uncrossing his legs and dropping to his knees. Richard, ever the helpful lawyer, also leaned down to help gather the sensitive documents. Monica took a step forward, her eyes briefly leaving me to look at the mess on the floor. That was my window. 3 seconds. That was all I needed. As their heads were turned, looking down at the scattered papers, I moved with a speed I had not used in years. I reached across the small space between us and grabbed Monica's identical coffee mug from the side table, where she had set it down. In one fluid motion, I swapped it with mine. By the time Derek and Richard popped back up, placing the slightly disorganized stack of papers back onto the table, my hands were resting calmly on my lap. I was holding Monica's coffee, and my poisoned cup was sitting exactly where hers had been. "All sorted," Richard said, slightly breathless. "Thank you," I replied, my voice smooth as ice. I raised the new mug to my lips, making sure Monica was watching me. "To the future of coal freight," I said, and I took a deep, long drink. The liquid was hot and bitter against my tongue. It was just coffee. Regular dark roast coffee. No chemical aftertaste, no sudden numbness in my throat. Monica was watching me like a hawk watching a field mouse. When she saw me swallow, a microscopic twitch of triumph pulled at the corner of her perfectly painted red lips. She thought she had won. She thought the old man had just swallowed the bait. I smiled back at her, a gentle grandfatherly smile that masked the absolute storm of adrenaline pumping through my veins. "Excellent blend, Monica," I said, my voice steady. "Only the best for you, Harrison," she replied, her voice sweet and melodic. She reached out and picked up the mug sitting on the edge of the glass table. She lifted it to her lips and took a delicate sip. I watched her throat work as she swallowed. A cold sweat broke out on the back of my neck. I had no idea what was in that cup. For all I knew, Elena was overreacting. Maybe it was just a mild sedative to embarrass me. But the look of pure, predatory anticipation in Monica's eyes told me otherwise. This was a calculated strike. Richard cleared his throat, pulling my attention back to the thick stack of papers on the mahogany table. "Now know that we have everything in order." He began pulling a gold pen from his inner jacket pocket. "We can proceed with the final review of the transfer clauses. Harrison, as we discussed last week, this document will grant Derek full operational and financial control of coal freight, effective immediately upon your signature." I nodded slowly, leaning back in my heavy leather chair. "Go ahead, Richard. Read the fine print. I want to make sure my boy here understands exactly what he is taking on." Derek shifted in his seat. His knee started bouncing again. "Dad, we really do not need to read every single page aloud. I have already gone over it with Richard. The notary is waiting in the foyer. We are burning daylight here." "Patience, Derek," I reprimanded him softly. "A man who cannot sit through a contract reading is not a man ready to manage 450 employees. Read it, Richard." Richard adjusted his glasses and began droning on in a monotonous legal cadence. I pretended to listen, nodding at all the right intervals, but my entire focus was locked onto Monica. She was sitting on the edge of the plush sofa, her posture perfect, her legs crossed. Every few minutes she would raise the ceramic mug to her lips and take another sip of the dark liquid. Each time she swallowed, I counted the seconds in my head. 10 minutes passed. Richard was halfway through the operational logistics clauses. I noticed the first sign that something was wrong. Monica's foot, which had been resting elegantly in her high heel, slipped sideways, knocking against the leg of the coffee table. It was a clumsy, uncoordinated movement, completely out of character for a woman who prided herself on flawless grace. 15 minutes passed. The color in her cheeks began to change. A thin sheen of sweat appeared on her forehead. She reached up with a trembling hand and brushed a stray lock of hair away from her eyes. Her blinking became heavy, sluggish, as if her eyelids were lined with lead weights. "Are you feeling all right, Monica?" I asked, interrupting Richard mid-sentence. Derek snapped his head toward his wife, annoyance flashing across his face. "She is fine, Dad. Please let Richard finish." "I am fine," Monica mumbled. But her voice did not sound like honey anymore. It was thick, garbled, like her tongue had swollen inside her mouth. "Just a little warm in here." She reached for her coffee mug again, her hand shaking so badly that the ceramic clattered violently against the glass tabletop before she managed to lift it. She took one final desperate gulp as if the coffee would somehow wake her up. That was her fatal mistake. Exactly 23 minutes after the swap, Richard finally flipped to the last page of the contract. He slid the document across the table toward me, uncapping the gold pen and holding it out. "This is it, Harrison." Richard set a tight, expectant smile on his face. "Sign right here, and the legacy is passed on." I reached my hand out slowly, letting my fingers hover over the polished gold barrel of the pen. The room was dead silent save for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Derek was holding his breath, his eyes wide with hungry anticipation. Suddenly, a sharp, ragged gasp shattered the silence. We all turned to look at the sofa. Monica was gripping the armrest with white-knuckled intensity. Her eyes were rolled back into her head, exposing the red-veined whites. Her jaw was locked open, and a thick line of white foam began to bubble at the corners of her mouth. "Monica," Derek asked, his voice cracking with sudden fear. He half stood from his chair, reaching a hand out toward her. "Honey, what is wrong?" She did not answer. Instead, a violent tremor ripped through her entire body. Her spine arched backward at an unnatural angle, and a horrific guttural choking sound erupted from her throat. The coffee mug slipped from her paralyzed fingers, crashing onto the hardwood floor and shattering into a dozen pieces, sending a dark stain spreading across the expensive rug. "Monica!" Derek screamed, diving across the space between them. But before he could reach her, her eyes snapped forward, unseeing and hollow. Her body went completely rigid, and then like a puppet with its strings suddenly cut, she pitched forward. She collapsed face first onto the heavy glass coffee table with a sickening, bone-rattling thud. The impact sent a spiderweb crack racing across the thick glass surface. She slid off the table and crumpled onto the floor, her limbs twitching sporadically, her chest heaving as she struggled for air. The foam around her mouth mixed with a thin trickle of blood from where she had bitten her own tongue. Panic erupted in the room. Richard leaped back from the table, his chair tipping over and crashing against the wall. He stood frozen in shock, his hands pressed over his mouth. Derek was on his knees beside her, screaming her name, shaking her shoulders, begging her to wake up. "Call an ambulance!" Derek shrieked, looking up at me with tears streaming down his face. "Dad, call an ambulance! She is dying!" I did not move. I did not reach for my phone. I just sat there in my heavy leather chair, my hands resting calmly on my knees, staring down at the woman convulsing on my rug. The air in the room was thick with terror, but my mind was crystal clear. The puzzle pieces locked together with a terrifying absolute certainty. The foam, the convulsions, the sudden catastrophic failure of her nervous system. This was not a prank. This was not a mild sedative meant to make me look foolish. This was a lethal, concentrated dose of something highly toxic. If I had not listened to Elena, if I had not swapped those cups in that 3-second window, it would be me writhing on that floor right now. My heart would be stopping. My brain would be shutting down. I looked at Derek, my own flesh and blood, kneeling in the spilled coffee and shattered porcelain. Had he known? Had my own son smiled at me while waiting for a poison to stop my heart? The realization hit me like a physical blow to the chest, driving the breath from my lungs. I was trapped in a room with monsters of my own making, and the war for my survival had only just begun. The sterile, blindingly white fluorescent lights of the emergency room waiting area buzzed with a low, maddening hum. The smell of harsh antiseptic and industrial floor cleaner clung to the back of my throat, replacing the lingering scent of the bitter coffee that had nearly ended my life. I sat on a hard, uncomfortable plastic chair, my hands folded neatly in my lap. To any nurse or passing doctor, I looked exactly like what I was supposed to be. A terrified, grieving father, paralyzed by the sudden medical emergency that had just shattered a joyous family occasion. But beneath my quiet exterior, my mind was racing with the cold, calculated precision of an engine running at top speed. Derek was pacing the length of the waiting room. He had torn his expensive silk tie from his neck and unbuttoned the collar of his shirt. He was sweating profusely, dragging his hands through his perfectly styled hair until it stood up in frantic tufts. He kept pulling out his phone, staring at the blank screen, and shoving it back into his pocket. He was panicking. But the more I watched him, the more I realized it was not the panic of a man terrified of losing his beloved wife. It was the erratic, cornered panic of a man whose meticulous plan had just catastrophically backfired. Richard Lawson stood near the vending machines in the corner. My trusted lawyer, the man who had drafted the paperwork, meant to strip me of my legacy, was whispering frantically into his cell phone. Every time he caught me looking in his direction, he would abruptly turn his back, hunching his shoulders to muffle his voice. The rats were scrambling because the ship had not sunk the way they intended. 2 agonizing hours dragged by. The automatic sliding doors of the emergency bay opened and closed, bringing in broken bones and feverish children, but no news of Monica. I used the time to observe. I memorized every nervous twitch my son made. I noted how he never once came over to comfort me or ask how I was holding up after witnessing such a traumatic event. His concern was entirely selfish. Finally, a doctor in wrinkled blue scrubs pushed through the swinging double doors that led to the intensive care unit. He looked exhausted, his face grim, carrying a silver clipboard. He scanned the waiting room until his eyes locked onto us. Derek practically sprinted across the linoleum floor, grabbing the doctor by the forearm before the poor man could even introduce himself. Is she alive? Derek demanded, his voice cracking loudly. Tell me she is alive. The doctor gently pried Derek's fingers off his arm and took a step back. I stood up slowly, leaning slightly on my cane, playing the frail old man, and walked over to join them. She is stable, the doctor said, keeping his voice level and professional. We managed to intubate her and administer a heavy dose of epinephrine. Her airway had almost completely closed by the time the paramedics loaded her into the ambulance. It was incredibly close. A few more minutes, and we would be having a very different, very tragic conversation. Derek let out a loud, exaggerated breath, wiping the sweat from his forehead. Thank God, he muttered, looking up at the ceiling. But the doctor did not smile. He looked down at his clipboard, flipping to the second page, and then looked directly at my son. Mr. Cole. The doctor continued, his tone shifting from comforting to investigative. Your wife did not suffer a random seizure, nor was this a standard allergic reaction to food. We ran a full toxicology screen while we were stabilizing her vitals. The results were highly irregular. Monica suffered severe anaphylactic shock, triggered by a massive unauthorized dose of a strong sedative, specifically a highly concentrated liquid form of benzodiazepine. The words hung in the air, heavy and sharp. Benzodiazepine, a tranquilizer, a drug used to suppress the central nervous system to induce confusion, lethargy, and a complete lack of coordination. It was the exact chemical cocktail needed to make a perfectly healthy 72-year-old man look like he had suddenly lost his mental faculties right before signing a legally binding contract. Given the concentration found in her bloodstream, the doctor added, adjusting his glasses, this was not an accidental overdose of prescription medication. This was a massive quantity introduced rapidly into her system. The hospital protocol requires me to ask, do you have any idea how she might have ingested this? A normal husband would have been confused. A normal husband would have asked how such a thing was possible or who could have done this to his wife. But Derek did not ask any of those logical questions. He did not look at me. He did not ask the doctor for more details. Instead, he exploded. It was the maid. Derek shouted, his voice echoing sharply across the quiet waiting room. Several nurses at the triage desk turned to look at us. I beg your pardon, the doctor asked, clearly taken aback by the sudden outburst. It was Elena, our housekeeper. Derek continued, his volume rising as he spun his frantic narrative. She is the one who brought the coffee. She is the only one who had access to the kitchen. She is old, doctor. She is completely senile and losing her mind. She takes those heavy sleeping pills for her arthritis pain, and she must have dropped them into the sugar jar. Yes, that is exactly what happened. The crazy old woman ground up her own pills and mixed them into my wife's drink by accident. I stood there listening to the desperate, pathetic lie spilling from my son's mouth. It was a terrible lie, full of holes. First of all, Elena did not take sleeping pills, and she certainly did not have arthritis. Second, and more importantly, both Monica and I drank our coffee entirely black. Derek, I said, my voice cutting through his hysterical rambling like a steel blade. Stop this nonsense right now. The doctor blinked, looking between the two of us. Derek froze, his mouth half open, his face flushed with a mixture of anger and panic. Elena does not take sleeping pills. I continued, keeping my tone deadly calm and steady. She has never had arthritis in her life. And even if she did, she knows perfectly well that neither Monica nor I take sugar in our coffee. We drink it black. We always have. There is absolutely no reason for anyone to be mixing anything into those cups. Derek swallowed hard. He took a step toward me, trying to use his height to intimidate me, but I did not back down an inch. Dad, you are in shock, he stammered. You do not know what you are saying. She is an old woman. She makes mistakes. She probably got confused and just threw something in there. Did she? I asked, raising an eyebrow. Because I seem to remember a very specific conversation we had just yesterday. I remember you standing in the kitchen, pointing your finger at Elena and explicitly, forbidding her from stepping foot in the living room while Richard was there. You told her that official business was for family only. You demanded that Monica be the one to serve the refreshments. You made sure Elena was nowhere near that coffee tray. Derek opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His face turned an ashen shade of gray. He glanced nervously at the doctor, then at Richard, who was still hovering by the vending machines, pretending not to listen. You planned every detail of that meeting, Derek, I pressed on, stepping closer to him. You insisted Monica bring the coffee. You insisted Elena stay away. So how exactly did Elena manage to drug a cup she was not allowed to touch in a room she was not allowed to enter? The doctor cleared his throat awkwardly. I will leave you two to discuss this privately, he said, backing away slightly. But I must inform you both that because this involves a highly regulated substance and a life-threatening emergency, the hospital is required by law to notify the authorities. A police officer will likely be by later to take a statement. Wait, no! Derek practically shouted, lunging forward to grab the doctor by the sleeve again. You do not need to call the police. It was a domestic accident. We will handle it internally. We will fire the housekeeper. There is no need to drag the authorities into this and ruin our family name in the press. The doctor gently but firmly removed Derek's hand from his arm. It is not a request, Mr. Cole. It is hospital policy. Excuse me. He turned and quickly walked back through the double doors, leaving us alone in the sterile waiting area. I watched my son. This was the moment the mask slipped completely. I have spent 40 years negotiating with union bosses, ruthless competitors, and seasoned politicians. I know how to read a man when he is backed into a corner. If your wife, the woman you supposedly love more than anything in this world, had just been poisoned by a negligent employee, your first instinct should be furious vengeance. You should be demanding the police arrest that employee immediately. You should be begging the hospital to do a full investigation to ensure your wife is safe. But Derek was not furious. He was terrified. His eyes darted wildly around the room. His breathing was shallow and erratic. He was not acting like a grieving husband, relieved that his wife had survived a near-fatal accident. He was acting like a criminal who had just realized the getaway car had a flat tire. He wanted the case closed immediately. He wanted Elena fired and out of the picture before anyone could ask her a single question. I looked at this boy, this grown man I had raised, and felt a profound, aching sorrow twist in my chest. When Evelyn died 5 years ago, my whole world collapsed. I was so consumed by grief and the demanding pressures of keeping the freight company afloat that I completely lost myself. During those dark years, it was Elena who held our home together. She was the one who made sure Derek had warm meals. She was the one who washed his clothes, listened to his teenage complaints, and kept him on a straight path when I was out on the road for weeks at a time. Elena practically raised him when I could not be there. She loved him like her own flesh and blood. And now, without a second of hesitation, Derek was ready to throw her to the wolves. He was willing to destroy the life of a loyal, innocent woman who had cared for him his entire life just to cover up his own sinister tracks. It was the ultimate betrayal, not just of me, but of every value Evelyn and I had tried to teach him. He had no honor. He had no loyalty. He only had greed. I needed to be absolutely certain before I unleashed the storm that was brewing inside me. I needed proof. I could not just accuse my son and my lawyer of attempted murder and corporate theft without undeniable evidence. They would just call me a paranoid, confused old man, which was exactly what they wanted in the first place. I took a slow, deep breath, forcing my heart rate to steady. I had to play the game a little longer. I had to let them think they still had the upper hand, while I quietly dismantled their entire operation from the inside out. Okay, Derek, I said softly, letting my tired shoulders slump forward to feign complete and utter exhaustion, as if the long day had finally broken my spirit. You are right, I whispered, staring at the floor. I am just tired, son. I cannot think straight. If you believe Elena is responsible, we must act. Derek sighed, running a hand through his hair, his shoulders dropping in relief. He thought the old man was finally too weak to fight back. I am glad you see reason, Dad, he said, using his patronizing tone. Firing her is not enough. Monica almost died. Her heart nearly stopped. Elena is dangerous. I am going to call the police when we leave. I will press charges for attempted murder and sue her for every penny she has saved. She needs to rot in a cell. He was willing to destroy a good woman, throw her into the legal system, and strip her savings just to build a firewall around his guilt. Richard joined us, sensing the tide turning. Derek is right, Harrison, the lawyer said smoothly. If the hospital reports this, the police will ask questions. It is better we control the narrative. A formal complaint establishes a suspect keeping the spotlight off our family and protecting the company image. I memorized Richard's smug look. He was not a lawyer advising a client, but a conspirator helping bury a crime. No, I said, keeping my voice frail. No police. No lawsuits. Derek bristled. Dad, you cannot be serious. After what she did. Listen to me, I interrupted, looking up at him with wide, watery eyes. I cannot handle a trial, Derek. I cannot handle the reporters camping outside the house, the police tearing through Evelyn's old things, the public spectacle of it all. If you sue her, it will drag on for months, maybe years. It will ruin the transition of the company. It will ruin everything I have worked for. I paused, letting the silence hang between us, letting the bait dangle in front of them. I will handle Elena. I continued, my voice barely above a whisper. I will go home right now. I will pack her bags myself. I will give her a quiet severance package in cash and send her on a bus to her sister in Texas by tonight. She will be gone forever. The police will have no one to question. We will tell them it was a horrible misunderstanding, a mix-up with Monica's own prescription, and we will make a generous donation to the hospital to ensure their absolute discretion. No scandal. No trial. Just peace. Derek stared at me, his jaw clenched tight. He was weighing his options. A trial meant a thorough investigation. A trial meant lawyers digging into phone records, bank statements, and hidden cameras. A trial was a massive risk. But an old man quietly sweeping the mess under the rug, making the primary witness disappear across state lines without a paper trail. That was a gift-wrapped solution to his problem. Richard nodded slowly, tapping his chin. From a strictly public relations standpoint, Harrison makes a valid point, Derek. If the maid simply vanishes and we refuse to press charges, the local police will likely drop the inquiry. They do not have the resources to chase a phantom over an unconfirmed poisoning, especially if the victim's husband declines to cooperate with the investigation. Derek took a deep breath, looking back toward the intensive care unit doors. Fine, he spat, pointing a warning finger at me. But she has to be gone today, Dad. I do not want to see her face ever again. When Monica comes home, that house needs to be completely empty. I promise you, I said, keeping my gaze lowered. She will be gone before the sun goes down. As I turned and slowly walked toward the hospital exit, leaning heavily on my cane to maintain the illusion of my frailty, a cold, burning clarity washed over my mind. My gut was screaming at me. Why was Derek so incredibly desperate to eliminate Elena from the house today? It was not just about having a convenient scapegoat for the poisoned coffee. If that were the case, sending her to prison would have been the perfect solution. But the moment I offered to make her disappear quietly, without police involvement, he jumped at the chance. He did not want the police talking to her. He did not want her answering questions under oath. She knew something. Elena had worked in that house for a quarter of a century. She was practically invisible to Derek and Monica. They treated her like a piece of furniture, talking freely in front of her, ignoring her presence as she cleaned their messes. But Elena was sharp. She saw everything. She heard everything. Her whispered warning to me in the living room was just the tip of the iceberg. Do not drink it. Trust me. Those were not the words of a woman who accidentally dropped sleeping pills into a sugar bowl. Those were the words of someone who had uncovered a deliberate, calculated plot. Derek knew that Elena had figured them out. He knew she was a loose end that could unravel their entire scheme, and he was terrified of what she might say if anyone gave her the chance to speak. I pushed through the heavy glass doors of the hospital lobby and stepped out into the biting chill of the afternoon air. I did not call for my driver. I walked straight to the taxi stand, my posture instantly straightening the moment I was out of their sight. The frail old man vanished, replaced by the executive who built a $42 million empire from scratch. I gave the driver my address and told him to step on it. I had to get to my house. I had to get to Elena before she actually packed her bags and left. I needed to know exactly what she saw, what she heard, and what monsters were living under my roof. The war had started, and I needed my soldier. The taxi ride back to the estate felt like the longest journey of my life. I watched the familiar streets blur past the window, but my mind was entirely focused on the battlefield my home had become. When the cab finally pulled up to the wrought iron gates, I paid the driver in cash and told him to keep the change. I walked up the sweeping driveway, the gravel crunching beneath my shoes. The mansion loomed ahead, silent and imposing in the afternoon light. It was a house built on decades of sweat, meant to be a safe sanctuary for my family. Now it felt like a beautifully decorated tomb holding a terrible secret. I unlocked the heavy oak door and stepped into the grand foyer. The silence inside was deafening. The antique grandfather clock ticked steadily, echoing through the empty halls with a mocking rhythm. I headed straight for the kitchen, praying I was not too late. I pushed open the swinging wooden doors and found exactly what I was hoping for and dreading at the exact same time. Elena was standing by the large marble island in the center of the room. A worn canvas duffel bag sat fully packed on one of the bar stools. She was not packing anymore. She was just staring blankly at the polished stone surface, a crumpled tissue clutched tightly in her trembling hands. When she heard the door swing shut behind me, she jumped, spinning around with a look of pure terror in her dark eyes. Tears were streaming down her weathered cheeks, carving clean lines through the light dusting of baking flour, clinging to her apron. "Mr. Cole," she choked out, her voice thick with heavy grief. "I am so sorry. I am packing my things right now. I will be out of your house in 10 minutes. I did not do this terrible thing. You have to believe me, I would never hurt your family." I walked quickly across the kitchen floor and gently placed both of my hands on her shaking shoulders. "Look at me, Elena," I said, keeping my voice soft but incredibly firm. "I know you did not do this. I have always known you are innocent. You are not fired, and you are certainly not leaving this house today." She blinked her tears, pausing for a brief second of absolute confusion. "But Derek said I had to go," she whispered. "He said I poisoned his wife and he was going to send me to prison for the rest of my life." I squeezed her shoulders gently to ground her. "Derek is a selfish liar," I replied, the bitter anger bleeding into my spoken words. "He is trying to frame you to cover his own sinister tracks. I only agreed to send you away so he would not call the police while we were at the hospital. I needed to buy us some crucial time. I need you right here, Elena. I need to know exactly what you saw before you warned me not to drink that black coffee." Elena took a deep, shuddering breath and wiped her wet eyes with the back of her sleeve. She reached deep into the front pocket of her apron. Her hand was shaking so badly she could barely pull the hidden object out. When she finally did, she placed it carefully onto the marble island between us. It was a crumpled, empty foil blister pack. I reached out and picked it up, smoothing out the crinkled metallic edges. The prescription label was partially torn, but the medical name was still perfectly legible. It was a high-grade liquid sedative, benzodiazepine. "Where did you find this?" I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerous, low whisper. "I found it this morning," she explained. "I was emptying the trash cans upstairs. In Monica's private bathroom, stuffed at the very bottom beneath wet makeup wipes, I found that empty package. I knew she did not have a prescription for anything like that. But that was not what scared me, Mr. Cole." I stared at the empty foil wrapper, feeling a cold, hard knot twist tightly in my stomach. "What scared you, Elena?" She leaned in closer, glancing nervously toward the swinging kitchen doors, as if expecting Derek to burst through them at any given moment. "Last night, I could not sleep," she began, her words rushing out in a terrified stream. "My knees were aching badly, so I got up to get a cold glass of water from the downstairs kitchen. It was 2 o'clock in the morning. When I walked up the back staircase, I heard quiet whispering. It was Derek and Monica. They were standing in the hallway right outside your private study. I stayed hidden in the shadows and listened carefully. Mr. Cole, they were arguing fiercely about the legal documents. Monica said he just needed to look completely confused and disoriented today. She said Lawyer Lawson would handle the rest of it. I did not understand what they truly meant until she handed you that specific cup of coffee. I saw the evil way she looked at you. I just knew something was terribly wrong. I stood frozen in place, the empty blister pack crinkling slightly in my tightening grip. 2 o'clock in the morning, standing outside my study. My mind raced backward, tearing through the events of the past year. 12 months ago, after a string of high-profile burglaries in our community, I had hired a security firm to upgrade the entire estate. Derek had been traveling in Europe with Monica at the time. I had told them about the new alarm system on the doors, but I completely forgot to mention the internal motion-activated cameras hidden in the crown molding of the main hallways and the kitchen. They did not know the cameras were there, and those advanced cameras recorded both video and crystal-clear audio directly to a secure server locked inside my study. I told Elena to lock the heavy deadbolts on the front and back doors. I instructed her to go to her room, pack nothing, and wait for my signal. I promised her that no one, especially not my own son, would ever lay a hand on her. She nodded, still trembling, but I could see a faint glimmer of trust returning to her eyes. I left her in the kitchen and walked swiftly down the long, dimly lit hallway toward my private study. My heart was pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I inserted the brass key into the lock of the thick oak door, turned it, and stepped inside. I locked it behind me, sealing myself inside the one room in this massive house that was entirely mine. This was where I had built Cole Freight. This was where I had negotiated contracts that made men twice my age sweat. Now it was a war room. I moved behind my large mahogany desk and opened the bottom right drawer. I reached far to the back, my fingers brushing against the cold steel of a concealed keypad. I typed in the 6-digit passcode that only I knew. A hidden panel beneath the floorboards hummed to life, and the encrypted security server booted up. I pulled my laptop closer, connected the direct feed cable, and launched the surveillance software. The screen flickered, displaying 12 different camera angles of my own home in high-definition black and white. My hands hovered over the keyboard. A part of me, the part that was still a father, desperately hoped that Elena was wrong. I hoped there was a misunderstanding. But the man who had survived the ruthless world of interstate shipping knew better. I took a deep breath and clicked on the kitchen feed. I dragged the timeline back to 8 o'clock this morning, exactly 1 hour before the lawyers were scheduled to arrive. The timestamp in the corner of the screen ticked forward silently. For a few minutes, the kitchen was empty. Then the swinging doors pushed open. Monica walked into the frame. She was already dressed in her immaculate designer outfit, her hair perfectly styled for the big occasion. I watched the screen intensely. She walked over to the coffee machine and began the brewing process. Everything looked completely normal at first. She arranged the fine china cups on the silver serving tray. She placed the sugar bowl and the cream pitcher exactly where they belonged. Then she stopped. She looked over her shoulder, her eyes scanning the empty kitchen, ensuring she was completely alone. Reaching into the deep pocket of her tailored trousers, she pulled out a small object. Even through the black and white lens, I recognized the shiny foil of the blister pack Elena had found in the trash. My breathing grew shallow as I watched my daughter-in-law work. She did not look nervous. She did not hesitate. Her movements were chillingly precise, like an assassin preparing a weapon. She placed the pills onto the marble island right where Elena and I had stood just minutes ago. Taking a heavy metal spoon from the drawer, she began to crush the sedatives with brutal, calculated force. She ground them down into a fine, invisible powder. She scraped the powder together and moved toward the tray. She did not put it in the sugar bowl like Derek had so desperately claimed at the hospital. She poured the crushed medication directly into my specific mug, the large black ceramic cup I used every single day. She stirred it vigorously into the steaming dark roast coffee until the powder completely dissolved. She wiped the spoon clean, threw the empty foil wrapper into her pocket, and picked up the tray. She smiled her sweet, innocent smile at the empty room and pushed through the swinging doors heading straight for the living room to serve me my death sentence. I paused the video. The image of her smiling face froze on my screen. I sat back in my leather chair, the silence of the study pressing down on me like a physical weight. The truth was absolute and undeniable. This was a premeditated, coordinated attack under my own roof, but as the initial shock began to fade, a cold, analytical logic took its place. I am a large man weighing over 200 pounds, with a constitution forged by decades of hard labor. The doctor at the hospital had clearly stated it was a massive dose for Monica, a petite woman weighing barely 120 pounds. That was why she went into anaphylactic shock and nearly died. But if I had consumed that exact same cup, the medical outcome would have been very different. It would not have killed me. It was not enough to stop a heart my size. I stared at the frozen frame of the crushed pills. It was a strong sedative, a tranquilizer. If I had swallowed that bitter coffee within 20 minutes, my speech would have become slurred. My hands would have shaken uncontrollably. I would have lost my balanced memory and cognitive functions right in the middle of a highly sensitive legal meeting. I would have looked exactly like a 72-year-old man experiencing a sudden, catastrophic mental breakdown, and who was sitting right across from me ready to witness this tragic decline. Richard Lawson, a legal professional authorized to make binding judgments on mental capacity. They did not want me dead. A sudden death would spark an autopsy, a police investigation, and a complicated execution of my will. They wanted me incapacitated. But why? If the contract on the table was genuinely just transferring the company to Derek, why drug me? Why risk everything just to make me look foolish? The realization hit me like a runaway freight train. The contract I was about to sign was not a transfer of leadership. It had to be something infinitely worse. My fingers flew across the keyboard, closing the kitchen video feed and opening the directory for the second-floor cameras. I needed to hear exactly what Elena had heard. I scrolled down the long list of encrypted files until I found the specific timestamp for the upstairs hallway right outside my heavy study door. 2:00 in the morning. I clicked the audio file, maximizing the volume equalizer on my laptop. The room filled with the low static hiss of digital background noise, followed by the soft, muffled sound of footsteps sinking into the thick hallway carpet. Then the voices began. They were speaking in hushed, urgent tones, but the advanced enhancement software stripped away the echo, making their words sickeningly clear. It was Derek. His voice trembled with that familiar, pathetic anxiety I had spent years trying to train out of him. "I do not know if I can go through with this, Monica," he whispered, his breathing ragged and uneven. "He is my father. If he catches on, if he notices the taste, he will destroy us. You know how sharp he is. He misses nothing." A brief pause hung in the recording, followed by a sharp, dismissive sigh. It was Monica. Her tone was completely devoid of the sweet, sugary warmth she always used in my presence. It was cold, metallic, and utterly ruthless. "Stop being a coward, Derek," she hissed, her voice dripping with pure contempt. "We have gone over this 100 times. The coffee is a dark roast. It is bitter. The powder dissolves completely and has absolutely no distinct flavor. He will just think it is a strong cup, and by the time it hits his bloodstream, he will not be capable of noticing anything at all." "But what if the dose is wrong?" Derek pleaded, his voice cracking like a frightened child. "What if he passes out before the meeting even starts? Or worse, what if it actually stops his heart?" I gripped the edge of my solid mahogany desk so hard my knuckles turned completely white. My own flesh and blood was standing right outside my private sanctuary, actively debating the lethal consequences of poisoning me, and his biggest concern was not my survival. His biggest concern was ruining the timeline of their twisted, greedy plan. "It will not kill him," Monica snapped, her impatience echoing loudly through the computer speakers. "I did the math. I researched the exact dosage for a man of his height and weight. It will just sedate him heavily. He will become extremely sluggish. His hands will shake. He will not be able to form a coherent sentence or remember what day it is. He just needs to look completely lost and confused when Lawson brings out the papers. Lawson will handle the rest." The recording continued, with Derek offering weak protests that Monica quickly crushed, but the rest of their conversation faded into white noise as my mind latched onto that single devastating sentence. Lawson will handle the rest. Richard Lawson. The man who had sat at my dining table for countless Thanksgiving dinners. The man who had stood beside me at my wife's funeral, placing a comforting hand on my shoulder and promising to always look out for my family's best interests. For 15 long years, I had trusted him with every intimate detail of my corporate empire and my personal estate. I paid him a small fortune in retainer fees, believing his professional loyalty was bulletproof. But he was not just turning a blind eye to my son's disgusting greed. He was the actual architect of the trap. Suddenly, the strange, frantic urgency Richard had displayed in the living room made perfect, terrifying sense. He was rushing the meeting. He was aggressively pushing for me to sign before I could thoroughly read the operational clauses. But more importantly, he was ready and waiting to officially document my mental state. If I had drank that coffee, if I had started slurring my words and dropping my gold pen, Richard would not have called an ambulance. He would have looked at Derek, shook his head with feigned legal sorrow, and formally declared me unfit to manage my own affairs. The thick document sitting on my glass coffee table was never a simple transfer of corporate leadership. It was a medical incapacitation clause, a durable power of attorney specifically designed to completely strip me of my legal rights. They were trying to force me into a medical conservatorship. If Richard, acting as my long-standing legal counsel, formally testified that my cognitive decline was sudden and severe, and if Derek, my only living relative, corroborated that elaborate lie with the staged event in my living room, no judge in the state would question it. They would legally take away my $42 million company. They would seize absolute control of my bank accounts, my stock investments, and the very roof over my head. I would become a helpless prisoner in my own life, locked away in some high-end nursing facility, while they brutally liquidated everything I had spent 4 decades building from scratch. I reached out and abruptly stopped the audio playback. The silence in the study returned, but it was no longer the comfortable, familiar silence of my private retreat. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a battlefield just before the first shot is fired. The betrayal was absolute, spanning both blood and business. My son, my daughter-in-law, and my lawyer had formed a sinister trinity of greed, plotting to steal my legacy and erase my dignity without a second thought. I slowly closed the laptop screen and pushed the machine away. The profound, aching sadness that had weighed heavily on my chest at the hospital completely evaporated, instantly replaced by a cold, burning rage. They thought I was just an exhausted old truck driver who got lucky. They thought age had made me soft, blind, and overly trusting. They had severely miscalculated. You do not survive 40 grueling years in the cutthroat logistics industry by rolling over and playing dead when you are attacked. You survive by being significantly smarter, entirely more ruthless, and 10 steps ahead of your enemies. I unlocked my bottom desk drawer and pulled out my private, secure mobile phone, an encrypted device neither Derek nor Richard even knew existed. I needed a new lawyer immediately, not a friendly family diplomat, and certainly not a corporate peacemaker. I needed a legal shark. I needed a ruthless litigator who specialized in severe corporate fraud, financial embezzlement, and tearing corrupt legal contracts to absolute shreds. And I needed to pack a bag and get out of this house before Derek returned from the hospital, so I could maneuver my retaliatory strike entirely from the shadows. I packed a small canvas duffel bag. I threw in my encrypted phone, a secure laptop, and the manila folder containing the unsigned documents I managed to slip off the living room table during the chaos of Monica's collapse. Before stepping out the door, I picked up my regular smartphone and dialed Derek's number. It rang 3 times before he answered. The background noise sounded like the hospital cafeteria. "Dad," he said, his voice laced with fake anxiety. "Is she gone?" I closed my eyes, injecting a heavy, pathetic tremor into my vocal cords. "Yes, son," I lied. "She is gone." I watched her get into a taxi. But Derek, this whole ordeal has taken a terrible toll on my heart. I feel completely overwhelmed. I cannot stay in this empty house tonight. It feels like the walls are closing in on me. Derek paused. "Where are you going to go, Dad?" I let out a long, ragged sigh. "I am going to take my old truck up to the cabin by Lake Oconee. I need a stress relief fishing trip for the weekend. Just a few days of total silence to process everything that has happened. I will turn my phone off, son. I just need to breathe." The relief radiating through the phone line was palpable. "That is a great idea, Dad," Derek replied, struggling to hide the sheer excitement in his voice. "You go rest. Get your strength back. We will reschedule the signing with Richard for next Tuesday after Monica is discharged. Do not worry about a thing here." I hung up the phone and tossed it onto the kitchen counter. I would leave it there all weekend. They could track its GPS to the house and assume I just forgot it in my old age. I walked out to the garage and bypassed the luxury sedan Derek insisted I buy. I pulled the tarp off my vintage pickup truck. The heavy steel door closed with a solid thud. I turned the ignition, and the deep roar of the engine echoed off the concrete walls. As I backed out of the driveway and merged onto the interstate, a profound transformation began to take hold of me. With every mile marker vanishing in my rearview mirror, I shed the gentle grandfather persona I had worn for the past decade. My hunched posture straightened. The trembling in my hands disappeared. My grip on the steering wheel tightened until my knuckles turned white. The nice old man they thought they were dealing with was officially dead. The apex predator was waking up. Driving down the highway, listening to the hum of the tires against the asphalt, my mind drifted back to the early days of coal freight. Derek and Monica only knew the corporate suites and massive dividend checks. They had absolutely no idea what it actually took to build an empire in the 1980s. They did not know about the ruthless freight wars in Chicago, where rivals would slash your tires to steal your designated routes. They did not know about the brutal midnight negotiations with corrupt union bosses, where a single sign of weakness meant losing everything. I survived that violent, unforgiving era because I was harder than the concrete I drove on. I broke men who were twice my size simply because I refused to be beaten. I built my fortune in the shadows, fighting tooth and nail for every single dollar. My own son had mistaken my quiet retirement for weakness. He thought because I wore a tailored suit and drank tea on the porch, my teeth had fallen out. He was about to learn a terrifying lesson about the kind of monster his father used to be. I did not drive north toward the peaceful cabin at Lake Oconee. Instead, I drove 3 towns over, deep into the city's aggressive financial district. I needed a legal battlefield, and I knew exactly where to find my general. I pulled the truck into a dark underground parking garage beneath a towering glass skyscraper. I took the elevator to the 47th floor, stepping out into a sleek, minimalist reception area. The silver letters mounted on the slate wall read, "Blackwood, Carmichael, and Stone." This was not a friendly law firm that handled polite divorces. This firm was a shark tank. They were a fiercely independent group of corporate litigators who specialized in forensic asset recovery and destroying corrupt executives in open court. They were the most feared legal mercenaries in the state. And today I was buying their entire arsenal. I walked past the receptionist without waiting to be announced and pushed open the heavy glass doors of the senior partner's corner office. Victor Carmichael looked up from his desk. He was a sharp, calculating man with cold eyes and a reputation for showing absolutely zero mercy to his opponents. He had represented me once 20 years ago during a vicious antitrust lawsuit. He took one look at my face and set his pen down. "You look like a man preparing for a slaughter," Harrison Victor said, leaning back in his expensive leather chair. I walked across the room, unzipped my rugged canvas bag, and pulled out the manila folder containing the unsigned contracts Richard Lawson had placed in front of me just hours earlier. I tossed the thick stack of papers onto his polished glass desk. It landed with a heavy, definitive smack. "I am not preparing for one, Victor," I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous gravel. "I am already in the middle of it. My son, my daughter-in-law, and my estate lawyer just tried to drug me and steal my entire $42 million company. I need you to read these documents. I need to know exactly what kind of legal trap they built. And then I need you to help me burn their entire lives to the ground." Victor slowly picked up the folder. Victor slowly picked up the folder. He did not say a word as he opened the thick manila cover. He reached into the breast pocket of his tailored charcoal suit, pulled out a pair of silver wire-rimmed reading glasses, and slipped them onto his face. For the next 10 minutes, the only sound in the expansive corner office was the sharp rustle of crisp paper turning. I sat across from him in a rigid leather chair, watching his eyes dart back and forth across the dense legal text. Victor was a man who had seen every dirty trick in the corporate playbook. He had dismantled Ponzi schemes, exposed offshore tax evasion, and ruined the careers of countless corrupt executives. Nothing surprised him. But as he reached the third page of the contract, I saw a subtle shift in his demeanor. His jaw tightened. The faint professional smirk vanished from his lips, replaced by a deep, rigid frown. He flipped back to the first page, cross-referencing a paragraph, and then let out a low, breathy whistle. Victor took off his glasses and tossed them onto the desk. He leaned forward, interlacing his fingers, and stared at me with an expression bordering on absolute disgust. "Harrison," he began, his voice dropping to a grim, serious register. "I have reviewed thousands of hostile takeover documents in my career. I have seen hostile boards vote out founders, and I have seen hostile family members fight over contested wills. But this is not a succession plan. This is a meticulously crafted legal execution." I leaned forward, resting my forearms on my knees. "Tell me exactly what they were going to do to me, Victor. Do not sugarcoat a single word." He tapped the stack of papers with his index finger. "This document is a blanket, durable power of attorney, but it is deeply conditional. It contains a highly specific triggering clause based on immediate severe medical incapacitation. If you had signed this today under normal circumstances, it would have transferred day-to-day operational control of coal freight to your son. But there is a secondary mechanism buried in the addendums. If the attending legal counsel, which in this case is Richard Lawson, formally witnesses and documents a sudden severe decline in your cognitive or physical abilities during the signing, the contract bypasses standard transition protocols." My blood ran cold as the pieces locked perfectly into place. The tranquilizer in the coffee, the slurred speech, and the trembling hands they were eagerly waiting for. Victor continued, his tone turning even darker. Lawson had structured this perfectly. If you drank that coffee and exhibited the symptoms of a stroke or severe dementia, Lawson would have stopped the meeting. He would have invoked this specific clause immediately. By the time an ambulance arrived, Lawson and Derek would have signed affidavits swearing that you had completely lost your mental faculties. Because Lawson is a licensed officer of the court, and your recognized estate attorney, a judge would have instantly approved an emergency medical conservatorship. I stared out the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking down at the tiny cars crawling through the city streets far below. A conservatorship, I repeated softly, the word tasting like ash in my mouth. Yes, Victor confirmed. And not just over your business, Harrison. Over your entire existence. Under these specific terms, Derek would become your absolute legal guardian. He would gain total, unquestioned control over your $42 million company. He would take possession of your estate, your personal bank accounts, your investment portfolios, and your vehicles. You would not be allowed to make a single financial transaction. You would not even be allowed to hire an independent lawyer to defend yourself because your son would control the funds to pay them. The sheer cruelty of the plot settled heavily onto my shoulders. They did not just want to inherit the money I had bled for. They wanted to erase my autonomy completely. They wanted to lock me away in a high-security nursing facility heavily medicated and silenced while they spent my life savings. They were going to bury me alive. This goes beyond corporate theft, Harrison Victor said, breaking the heavy silence. This is criminal conspiracy, attempted grievous bodily harm, and massive legal fraud. Lawson is risking disbarment and a lengthy federal prison sentence by drafting this document and acting as a willing participant in the poisoning. Derek and your daughter-in-law are risking attempted murder charges. They were incredibly desperate. No one takes a risk this monumental unless they are staring down the barrel of a loaded gun. Victor was right. My son was lazy and greedy, but he was also a profound coward. He would never attempt something so wildly dangerous unless he was backed into a corner he could not escape. Monica might have provided the poison and the ruthless ambition, but Derek had to be motivated by something much larger than simple impatience. There was a hidden variable in this equation, a massive secret they were terrified I would discover if I retained control of the company for even one more month. I looked back at Victor. The initial shock had completely burned away, leaving nothing but cold, hardened steel in its wake. I want to know why I said my voice steady and commanding. I want a full, microscopic investigation into every single aspect of Derek and Monica's lives. I want to know where they spend every dime. I want to see their credit lines, their offshore accounts, their private investments, and their hidden debts. Victor smiled. It was a terrifying, predatory smile. He reached across his desk and pressed a silver button on his intercom. Send in the forensic accounting team, he instructed his secretary. Cancel all my remaining appointments for the week. We are going hunting. He released the button and looked back at me. By Monday morning, Harrison, we will know every dark secret your son has ever committed. Victor did not waste a single second. Within an hour, I was sitting across from a woman named Eris Thorne. She did not look like a traditional accountant. She had the cold, unblinking stare of an apex predator, the kind of woman who could find a missing dollar in a billion-dollar haystack and ruin an executive's life before her morning coffee. I gave her Derek's social security number, Monica's maiden name, and full authorization to bypass any financial privacy walls using my status as the primary guarantor on several of their early marital loans. I told her I did not just want bank statements. I wanted the deleted emails, the offshore wire transfers, the hidden cryptocurrency wallets, and the dark web gambling ledgers. I wanted to know exactly what kind of financial fire my son was trying to put out by burning me alive. Eris simply nodded her fingers, already flying across her encrypted laptop. She told me it would take 48 hours to completely unmask them. That left me with the weekend. 2 days to let the anger simmer and condense into something lethal and precise. But I could not just disappear. If I stayed completely off the grid, Derek and Richard might panic and accelerate their timeline. I needed to keep them comfortable. I needed them to believe the old man was still deeply shaken, completely oblivious to their treachery. So on Saturday afternoon, I drove my truck back from the city, stopped at a florist, and bought an extravagant bouquet of white lilies, the traditional flower of sympathy, and fittingly, the traditional flower of death. I walked into the hospital with the heavy, slow steps of a grieving father. Monica had been moved from the intensive care unit to a private recovery suite. When I pushed open the heavy wooden door, the room smelled of sterile bleach and artificial vanilla. Monica was propped up against a mountain of white hospital pillows. She looked pale and fragile, an intravenous drip still connected to the back of her hand. Derek was sitting in a chair beside her bed, scrolling mindlessly on his phone. When they saw me, their entire demeanor shifted instantly. Derek jumped to his feet, a look of manufactured relief washing over his face. Monica offered me a weak, trembling smile, playing the perfect tragic victim. "Oh, Harrison." Monica whispered, her voice raspy from the intubation tube that had saved her life. "You came back from the cabin. You should not have cut your trip short for me." I walked over to the side of the bed, placing the massive bouquet of white lilies on the bedside table. I looked down at her. This was the woman who had meticulously crushed a lethal dose of tranquilizers into a fine powder. This was the woman who had smiled in my face while handing me a poisoned cup, fully intending to watch me lose my mind and my dignity. Standing this close to her, the urge to wrap my hands around her throat was almost blinding. It took every ounce of discipline I had forged over 40 years in the freight business to keep my expression soft and sorrowful. "I could not stay away, sweetheart," I said, my voice thick with fake emotion. "Not when my family is hurting. I was so terrified we were going to lose you. I just had to see with my own eyes that you were safe." Monica reached out with her trembling hand, the one with the needle taped to the skin, and gently squeezed my arm. It was so scary, she lied, tears welling up perfectly in her calculating eyes. "The doctor said I had a severe allergic reaction to something in the kitchen. I do not even know how it happened. But I am just so glad you are okay, Harrison. The stress of the day could have been terrible for your heart." The sheer audacity of her words felt like a physical blow. She was fishing. She was trying to see if I suspected anything about the coffee. I patted her hand gently, fighting the revulsion that crawled across my skin at her touch. "I am perfectly fine, Monica," I assured her, pasting a warm, oblivious smile on my face. "My heart is stronger than it looks. We just need to focus on getting you home. Derek tells me you should be discharged by Tuesday. We can finally put this terrible nightmare behind us and move forward with the company transfer. Richard has all the paperwork ready whenever you two feel strong enough." Derek let out a breath he had clearly been holding. The greed flashed so brightly in his eyes it was almost blinding. "That is incredibly generous of you, Dad," Derek said quickly, stepping forward. "Monica just needs a few more days of rest. Tuesday will be perfect. We can do it at the house just like we planned. Nice and quiet." "Nice and quiet," I echoed, nodding slowly. "Exactly." I stayed in that hospital room for another hour. I played the part of the devoted, harmless patriarch so perfectly that they completely dropped their guard. They thought the finish line was in sight. They thought the millions were practically resting in their soft hands. They had absolutely no idea that every smile I gave them was a nail in their coffin. When I finally left the hospital, the sun was beginning to set. Once the heavy doors closed behind me, the facade instantly crumbled. My jaw ached fiercely from clenching my teeth. My hands were shaking not from age or weakness, but from the massive surge of pure adrenaline. I climbed back into the cab of my vintage truck, gripping the worn steering wheel. Monday morning finally arrived. My encrypted phone buzzed violently. It was Victor. He told me Aris had finished the sweep. "You need to come to my office right now, Harrison. We have found exactly what you are looking for. It begins." I drove back into the city with a singular focus. The morning traffic was a blur of brake lights and exhaust, but my mind was completely clear. I pulled into the underground garage of Victor's building, bypassed the receptionist on the 47th floor, and walked straight into the conference room. Victor was already there, standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows with a cup of black coffee. Iris Thorne sat at the long mahogany table. She did not look tired despite having worked through the entire weekend. A thick black binder sat in the center of the table directly in front of an empty leather chair. That chair was for me. I walked over, sat down, and placed my hands flat on the cool wood. "Give it to me," I said, my voice steady. "Do not leave out a single detail." Iris opened the binder. The first page was a summary sheet displaying a single massive number printed in bold red ink. $7.5 million. I stared at the number, feeling a strange mix of disgust and absolute disbelief. I knew Derek liked expensive suits and fast sports cars, but this was not a lifestyle debt. This was a catastrophic financial collapse. "How did he manage this?" I asked, looking up at Iris. She tapped her pen against the ledger. "Your son is a spectacular failure at risk management." "Harrison," she began, her tone purely clinical. 2 years ago, Derek and Monica started heavily leveraging their personal assets to buy into high-risk cryptocurrency portfolios. When the market took a massive dive, they did not pull out. They doubled down. They took out shadow loans using your company's future projections as collateral to chase their losses. When that money vanished in a digital crash, Derek panicked. He turned to underground gambling to try and win it back quickly. Iris flipped to the next page, revealing dozens of blurry photographs and scanned transaction logs. These are offshore wire transfers to private casinos in Macau, and local payments routed through shell companies connected to an illegal sports betting syndicate operating right here in the city. He was betting hundreds of thousands of dollars on single games, completely desperate to cover the missing crypto funds before the shadow lenders came collecting. But the house always wins, and Derek lost everything. I looked at the photographs of my son sitting at dimly lit poker tables, sweating through his expensive silk shirts. He was not a criminal mastermind. He was a pathetic, desperate addict digging his own grave. "But $7.5 million, I muttered, shaking my head. "How did they let his tab run that high?" Victor turned away from the window and walked over to the table. "Because they know exactly who his father is, Harrison," Victor said, his voice grim. "They let him borrow the massive amount of money because they did not see Derek Cole as the debtor. They saw Cole Freight as the ultimate collateral." Iris nodded in agreement. "The syndicate Derek owes is not a group of forgiving bankers," she explained, sliding a surveillance photo across the table. It showed a man with a shattered jaw being loaded into an ambulance. These people do not send polite collection letters. They break legs. They burn down houses. According to intercepted communications we pulled from the dark web ledgers, they gave Derek a final ultimatum exactly 3 weeks ago. Pay the debt in full by the end of this month, or they will make a violent example out of him and his wife. I sat back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. The puzzle was finally complete. The intense urgency, the rushed meeting, the poison. They were not just impatient heirs tired of waiting for the old man to die. They were cornered rats facing immediate, brutal execution. If Derek did not get his hands on my $42 million company, the syndicate was going to kill him. He was perfectly willing to trade my life, my freedom, and my dignity to save his own skin. A normal father might have felt a sudden surge of protective instinct. A normal father might have paid the ransom to save his only child. But the man sitting in that conference room was no longer just a father. I was a man who had survived the absolute worst the world had to offer, only to be betrayed by the very boy I had bled to protect. "Do they have any legal claim to my company?" I asked, locking eyes with Victor. "None," Victor replied firmly. "Because Derek does not have his name on the primary deed or the corporate charter, their shadow contracts are legally worthless. They can torture Derek, but they cannot touch a single truck in your fleet unless you sign that power of attorney over to him. If you sign, the syndicate will force him to liquidate Cole Freight in a matter of days. Your loyal employees will be out on the street, and your life's work will be chopped up to pay for your son's gambling addiction. I reached out and slowly closed the heavy black binder. The finality of the sound echoed loudly in the quiet conference room. I am not signing anything, I said, my voice as cold as ice, and I am not paying a single dime of this debt. Let the wolves have him. Victor slowly nodded, a look of deep respect crossing his face. He knew what it cost me to say those words. What is the next move, Harrison? He asked, folding his hands on the glass desk. I stood up, my joints popping slightly in the silent room. The anger inside me had completely crystallized into an unbreakable weapon. We let them believe they have won, I told him, walking toward the heavy wooden doors. We let them set the stage for tomorrow, and then I am going to tear the floor out from under them. I turned the brass handle, fully ready to leave the conference room and prepare for war. But before stepping into the hallway, Iris Thorne cleared her throat. The quiet sound carried an undeniable weight that stopped me dead in my tracks. Harrison, Iris said, her voice dropping to a serious register. You need to sit back down. We are not finished yet. I slowly turned around, my hand resting on the polished door handle. Victor stood silently by his desk, his expression darker than it had been all morning. He gestured toward the empty leather chair I had just vacated. The $7.5 million debt explains why your son is desperate. Victor explained, his tone heavy with dread. It explains the poison. It explains the rushed conservatorship. But there was a missing piece. A logistics empire is not a liquid asset. You cannot simply hand over a power of attorney and withdraw millions to pay off a criminal syndicate. Liquidating a company requires board approvals, regulatory filings, and months of complex financial restructuring. Derek does not have months. The syndicate gave him until the end of the month. I walked slowly back to the table and sat down, staring at the forensic accountant. So how was he planning to get the cash? Iris reached into her briefcase and pulled out a thin manila folder. It was entirely unmarked. She slid it across the table until it rested in front of me. He was not planning to liquidate legally, Iris said, folding her hands together. He found a buyer willing to bypass the federal waiting periods. A buyer happy to operate in the shadows, waiting for the medical conservatorship to be signed. He engineered a backdoor corporate buyout. I opened the thin folder. Inside was a drafted letter of intent, heavily redacted, but completely recognizable in structure. I scanned the first few lines, looking for the name of the purchasing entity. When my eyes landed on the bold black ink of the corporate letterhead, the air vanished from my lungs. Apex Logistics. A blinding, white-hot fury erupted in my chest, completely eclipsing the anger over the poisoning. They were my oldest, most ruthless rival in the industry. For 2 decades, I fought bloody corporate wars against their chief executive, a man possessing absolutely no moral compass. Apex did not build logistics networks. They were corporate vultures. They swooped in, bought struggling companies, and stripped them for parts. Tell me what I am looking at. I demanded, my voice trembling with profound rage. It is a pre-arranged sale agreement, Victor said, stepping up behind my chair. Derek negotiated this directly with the chief executive of Apex 3 weeks ago, right after the syndicate issued their death threat. The moment Richard Lawson handed Derek the medical conservatorship, Derek was legally authorized to accept this buyout without consulting the board. He was going to sell Cole Freight to Apex for pennies on the dollar. I stared at the numbers printed at the bottom of the contract. My life's work. 40 years of sleepless nights and relentless sacrifice. Derek had agreed to sell the entire $42 million empire for a paltry $9 million. It was just enough to pay off his gambling debt, cover Richard Lawson's bribes, and leave him with a small cushion to flee the state. Apex knew exactly what they were doing. Iris added, pointing to a specific clause hidden on the second page. They knew Derek was desperate, so they offered a fraction of the actual value in exchange for an immediate cash transfer. And the most devastating part is the structural absorption plan. Apex has absolutely no intention of keeping coal freight operational. I closed my eyes, the crushing reality of the situation slamming into me. I did not just see the trucks, warehouses, or corporate branding. I saw faces. I saw Arthur, my lead mechanic for 30 years, a man just 2 years away from a hard-earned retirement. I saw Maria, the dispatcher, working brutal night shifts to put her children through college. I saw the faces of 450 loyal men and women who trusted me with their livelihoods. If Apex Logistics took control, they would immediately dissolve the fleet. They would fire every single employee on the very first day. Worse, Apex was infamous for raiding corporate pension funds to absorb the cost of territorial expansions. My people, the men and women who built my wealth, would lose their jobs, health insurance, and life savings. This was no longer just a family dispute. This was no longer a story about a greedy son stealing from his elderly father. This was a fight for survival. Derek was not just willing to sacrifice me to save his life. He was willing to destroy 450 innocent families who had nothing to do with his gambling addiction. I opened my eyes and stared down at the Apex logo on the paper. The sadness that had haunted me since the hospital vanished. The betrayal of my bloodline no longer mattered. Derek ceased to be my son the moment he negotiated the destruction of my people. He was just a thief, a coward who needed to be systematically dismantled. I slowly closed the folder and pushed it back across the desk toward Eris. I looked at Victor, my expression completely void of any mercy or hesitation. The nice old man they thought they were dealing with was dead and buried. "I want you to draft a new contract, Victor," I said, my voice cutting the silent room like a razor blade. "I am going to let them hold their signing ceremony tomorrow afternoon. I am going to let them finally think they have won the world. And then I am going to drop a bomb on their entire existence. I need you to prepare all the necessary legal documents right now. We are now going to a completely unforgiving war." I left Victor Carmichael's office and took the private elevator down to the underground parking garage. The concrete walls felt cool and damp, a stark contrast to the burning heat radiating inside my chest. I climbed into the cab of my truck and shut the heavy steel door, sealing myself in the quiet dark. I did not turn the key in the ignition. Instead, I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my everyday smartphone. It was time to set the final trap. I needed to hand my son the exact rope he would use to hang himself. I closed my eyes, took a deep, steadying breath, and forced my heart rate to slow down. I needed to bury the ruthless executive and resurrect the frail, terrified old man I had played in the hospital. I let my shoulders slump. I relaxed my jaw until my breathing sounded shallow and labored. I dialed Derek's number and held the phone to my ear, listening to the hollow ringing on the other end of the line. He picked up on the second ring. "Dad," Derek asked. His tone was casual, but I could hear the tight coil of anxiety hiding just beneath the surface. "Are you still up at the cabin?" "Yes, son," I replied, injecting a heavy, pathetic tremor into my voice. I made sure to let out a weak, rattling cough before continuing. "I am still here, but I do not think the fresh air is doing much good. I feel terrible, Derek. My chest is tight. My hands will not stop shaking. This whole situation with Monica, it has taken something out of me, something I do not think I am going to get back." The silence on the line was thick with anticipation. I could practically hear the gears turning in my son's head, calculating how he could use my sudden vulnerability to his absolute advantage. "You need to rest, Dad," Derek said, his voice dripping with feigned sympathy. "You have been pushing yourself too hard for years. The stress is finally catching up with you." "You are right," I whispered, making my voice crack perfectly on the last syllable. "You have always been right about that. I am too old for this, Derek. I cannot carry the weight of coal freight anymore. The thought of going back into that office, of dealing with the unions and the supply chains, it makes my blood run cold. I need to be done. I want to step down immediately." Derek exhaled a sharp, shuddering breath. He was trying to mask his overwhelming excitement, but he was failing miserably. "Okay, Dad. Okay. If that is what you truly want, we can make it happen. Monica is being discharged on Tuesday morning. We can have Richard come to the house on Tuesday afternoon. We can sign the papers quietly in the living room, just like we originally planned. Nice and easy." "No," I said, my voice suddenly finding a tiny fraction of its usual strength, just enough to sound stubborn and nostalgic. "Not just in the living room. Not like a secret. I spent 40 years of my life building that company from a single rusted truck. I sacrificed my youth, my sleep, and my health for coal freight. If I am going to hand over the keys to my kingdom, I am not going to do it hiding in my own house." "What are you saying, Dad?" Derek asked, the panic suddenly returning to his voice. He did not want complications. He wanted a swift, silent execution. "I want the entire board of directors there," I demanded, maintaining the stubborn old man routine. "I want to invite them to the house on Tuesday afternoon. I want a formal signing ceremony. I want the men and women who helped me build this empire to witness my retirement and see me pass the torch to my only son. I want it to be official, Derek. It is my final request as the head of this family." "Dad, I do not know." Derek stammered, clearly thrown off balance by the sudden demand. "The board members are busy people. Getting all of them to the house on such short notice might be impossible. And it will be so stressful for you. Are you sure you are up for a big crowd?" "I am sure," I insisted, coughing again for good measure. "You tell them it is a mandatory emergency session. Tell them my health is failing and I am stepping down. They will come. They respect me too much to ignore my final summons. If the board is not there to witness it, Derek, I will not sign a single piece of paper. I will just let the company sit in limbo." That was the ultimate threat, and I knew it would work perfectly. Derek could not afford a delay. The syndicate was breathing down his neck, and Apex Logistics was waiting in the shadows with their vulture buyout. He needed that medical conservatorship signed on Tuesday, and if parading the board of directors through my dining room was the only way to get my signature, he would make it happen. "Okay, Dad," Derek finally conceded, swallowing hard. "I will make the calls. I will have Richard draft the official notices tonight. We will set up the grand dining room for Tuesday at 3 o'clock. The entire board will be there." "Thank you, son," I murmured softly. "I knew I could count on you to do the right thing." I pulled the phone away from my ear and ended the call. The pathetic, shaking persona instantly vanished. I sat in the quiet cab of my truck, staring blankly at the concrete wall of the parking garage. The trap was officially set. Derek thought the board was coming to witness my glorious retirement, to see him crowned as the new king of coal freight. Richard Lawson thought the board was coming to serve as credible witnesses to my sudden, tragic mental collapse, solidifying his fraudulent conservatorship beyond any legal doubt. They were both completely wrong. The board of directors was not coming to attend a retirement party, and they certainly were not coming to witness my demise. They were coming to serve as a jury. I wanted the most powerful people in my company sitting in that room when I finally tore the mask off my son's face. I wanted them to see exactly what kind of monster had tried to sell them out to Apex Logistics. I turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, a deep, powerful sound that resonated in my chest. I pulled out of the parking garage and merged into the heavy afternoon traffic. I had less than 48 hours to finalize the battle plan with Victor. Every legal document had to be absolutely bulletproof. Every piece of hidden camera footage and audio recording had to be queued up and ready to play. I drove back toward my empty mansion, with a terrifying sense of calm washing over me. The tears were gone. The heartbreak was completely gone. All that remained was a cold, calculating desire for absolute justice. Tuesday was coming, and hell was coming with it. Tuesday afternoon arrived with a heavy, suffocating humidity that seemed to seep through the thick stone walls of the mansion. The grand dining room, a space usually reserved for joyous holiday feasts and quiet family celebrations, had been completely transformed into a corporate theater. I stood at the top of the sweeping staircase, hidden perfectly within the dark shadows of the second-floor landing, silently watching the eager players take their final marks. 12 senior members of the Coal Freight Board of Directors were seated around the massive polished oak table. These were men and women I had known for decades. We had weathered devastating economic crashes, severe fuel shortages, and vicious labor disputes together. Today, they were murmuring in hushed, respectful tones, clearly uncomfortable with the somber nature of this gathering. Derek had played his deceitful part perfectly over the phone. He had thoroughly convinced them that they were here to witness the tragic, medically necessary retirement of their founding patriarch. Derek was standing proudly at the head of the table. He was wearing a brand-new, custom-tailored navy blue suit, undoubtedly purchased with stolen money he did not actually have. He was sweating profusely. I could see the dark, damp patches forming under his arms and the constant nervous twitch in his jaw as he forced a confident smile for the veteran board members. He kept checking his expensive gold watch, shifting his weight unevenly from foot to foot. He was a desperate man standing on a fragile trapdoor, anxiously waiting to pull the lethal lever on someone else before the floor completely fell out from under his own feet. Seated slightly to his right was Monica. She had been officially discharged from the hospital just 4 hours earlier. She looked exceptionally pale, her features noticeably sharp and drawn from the severe allergic reaction, but the expression dancing in her dark eyes was one of pure, unadulterated victory. She was wearing a modest, high-collared white dress, brilliantly playing the role of the devoted, traumatized wife who had miraculously survived a terrible household accident. The unsuspecting board members offered her warm, sympathetic nods, completely unaware that the fragile woman sitting quietly before them was a cold-blooded architect of murder. She held a fresh ceramic cup in her hands, resting it delicately on a silver saucer. Richard Lawson was positioned directly across from my son, carefully organizing thick stacks of legal documents with practiced methodical precision. He wore a deeply solemn expression, presenting the perfect, flawless mask of a trusted legal advisor guiding a grieving family through a difficult corporate transition. He arranged 3 separate luxury pens in a perfectly straight line, ensuring everything was completely ready for the exact moment I entered the room. The fraudulent medical conservatorship was hidden cleverly beneath a standard corporate title page, primed and ready to be weaponized the second I showed the absolute slightest sign of physical weakness or mental confusion. But it was the unknown man sitting quietly in the far back corner of the grand room that made my blood run absolutely cold. He was seated intentionally away from the main table, partially obscured by the heavy dark velvet curtains drawn across the large bay windows. He wore a sharp slate gray suit that stood out aggressively against the traditional conservative business attire of my loyal board members. He had slicked back dark hair and the intense, hungry posture of a ruthless corporate raider. He was not a respected member of my board. He was not a junior lawyer from Richard Lawson's firm. I knew exactly who this man was because Victor Carmichael had shown me his surveillance photograph just the day before. His name was Gregory Pierce. He was the senior vice president of hostile acquisitions for Apex Logistics. The sheer unbridled arrogance of my only son was truly staggering to witness. Derek had actually invited the ultimate enemy right into my own home. He brought the Apex representative here to personally witness the fraudulent signing, ensuring the illegal backdoor buyout could be executed the very second the medical conservatorship was legally cemented by Richard. Gregory Pierce was sitting comfortably in my dining room, quietly sipping a crystal glass of ice water, eagerly waiting to purchase the financial slaughter of 450 innocent working families. I tightly gripped the carved wooden railing of the staircase. My knuckles turned stark white under the immense pressure. I let the burning anger flood my veins for one final silent moment, a raging surge of righteous fury that sharpened my mental focus to an absolute razor's edge. Then I buried that intense fire deep inside my chest. I deliberately hunched my broad shoulders forward. I let my right hand tremble violently as I gripped the silver handle of my walking cane. I took a shallow, ragged breath, letting my mouth hang open slightly, and began the slow, agonizing descent down the stairs. The rhythmic tapping of my cane against the hardwood steps echoed loudly into the formal dining room. The hushed, polite conversations abruptly stopped. As I reached the bottom of the long stairs and shuffled slowly into the wide archway, every single eye in the room turned directly toward me with profound pity. I played the broken, defeated man perfectly. I did not look directly at the board members. I kept my weary gaze fixed firmly on the floor, dragging my left foot slightly across the expensive rug as I moved toward the empty leather armchair, waiting for me at the opposite end of the long mahogany table. I heard a few of the older board members gasp softly. They were looking at a man who had commanded vast rooms with a powerful voice like thunder just a month ago, now tragically reduced to a shuffling, pathetic shadow. Derek immediately rushed to my side, gripping my elbow tightly to help me sit down, smiling warmly for his audience. The final, deadly execution trap was perfectly set for today. I sank into the heavy leather armchair at the head of the table. The soft creak of the leather seemed entirely too loud in the quiet, tense room. Derek patted my shoulder, a gesture so dripping with artificial affection it made my skin crawl. He took his seat to my immediate right, leaving Monica standing near the silver serving tray on the mahogany sideboard. She picked up the freshly brewed cup of black coffee she had prepared specifically for me. The porcelain rattled slightly against the saucer as she walked toward my chair. The room watched her, seeing only a dutiful, caring daughter-in-law tending to an ailing patriarch. I saw a calculating predator moving in for the kill. She set the saucer down in front of me with a soft clink. "I have made your favorite dark roast, Harrison," she murmured, her voice laced with that same sickeningly sweet honey she had used just days before. "Drink up. It will give you the strength you need for today." I reached out and wrapped my thick, scarred fingers around the warm ceramic mug. I slowly lifted my head and looked her dead in the eye. I did not blink. For a fraction of a second, I let the frail old man facade slip, allowing a cold, piercing glint of absolute awareness to shine through. I saw the muscles in her neck tighten. I saw a fleeting shadow of doubt cross her beautiful, treacherous face. But before she could fully process that look, I smiled. It was a wide, gentle, grandfatherly smile. "Thank you, Monica." I rasped, my voice trembling perfectly. "You are always so very good to me." I lifted the mug to my lips and tilted it back, taking a long, deliberate swallow. I lowered the cup, letting out a satisfied sigh, and watched the tension drain completely from her shoulders. She turned and walked back to her seat, a silent victory march. Richard Lawson cleared his throat, adjusting his silver wire-rimmed glasses as he stood up from the table. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," he began, projecting his smooth, authoritative voice across the expansive dining room. "We are gathered here today to honor the incredible legacy of Harrison Cole and to formally execute the transition of executive power to his son, Derek." Richard opened the thick leather binder containing the fraudulent documents. He began to read the preliminary clauses, his tone dripping with practiced solemnity. I sat perfectly still, listening to the monotonous drone of legal jargon, while my internal clock started counting down the minutes. I knew exactly how long the sedative took to enter the bloodstream. I had researched the chemical properties of the benzodiazepine Monica used. 20 minutes for the initial lethargy to set in. 30 minutes for the severe cognitive impairment and muscular tremors to completely take over. I let the time pass. I watched the board members. Some looked genuinely heartbroken, wiping away stray tears. Others stared at the polished wood table, uncomfortable with the harsh reality of aging. I watched the Apex Logistics representative in the corner, who was busy typing discreetly on his phone, likely updating his corporate vultures that the prey was almost secured. 25 minutes passed. I let my chin drop slightly toward my chest, as if the sheer weight of my own head was becoming too much to bear. My breathing grew shallow and uneven. At exactly 30 minutes, I began the final act of my performance. Richard had just finished reading a clause regarding the transfer of voting rights, and he slid a crisp white sheet of paper across the table toward me. He uncapped a heavy gold pen and held it out. "Please sign here, Harrison," he said softly. I reached for the pen. I commanded my hand to shake. It was a subtle, rhythmic tremor at first, just a slight vibration in my fingers. As I grasped the smooth gold barrel of the pen, I let the tremor violently escalate. The pen slipped from my grip, clattering loudly against the polished mahogany table and rolling onto the floor. "Oh," I mumbled, my voice thick and heavily slurred. "I am sorry. My hands, they will not listen to me." I reached down to pick it up, purposely knocking my coffee mug with my elbow. The remaining dark liquid spilled across the documents and dripped onto the expensive rug. I slumped back into my chair, letting my eyes roll back slightly, my mouth hanging open in a mask of total confusion. "Where are we?" I stammered, looking around the room with wide, unseeing eyes. "Evelyn, is that you?" Evelyn was my deceased wife. The mention of her name sent a shockwave through the board members. Several of them gasped out loud. Derek leaned forward, locking eyes with Richard Lawson. I saw the triumphant, greedy spark ignite between them. It was the look of two thieves who had successfully pulled off the ultimate heist. Derek grabbed my shoulder, feigning absolute panic. "Dad," he cried out loud. "Dad, what is wrong with you? You are not making any sense." Richard stood up abruptly, holding his hands out to calm the murmuring board of directors. "Please, everyone remain calm," Richard announced, his voice booming with heavy manufactured sorrow. "As your legal counsel, it is my sworn duty to protect the interests of this company and its founder. It is painfully obvious to all of us in this room that Harrison is currently suffering from a rapid, severe cognitive decline. He is completely disoriented and physically incapacitated. Therefore, for his own safety and the absolute preservation of this company, I must legally invoke the emergency medical conservatorship clause effectively immediately." The room erupted into shocked whispers. The apex executive in the corner finally smiled, closing his phone. The trap had sprung flawlessly, and they fully believed they had just conquered my world. They had no idea that I held the ultimate power over them. Lawson's words hung in the air like a heavy executioner's blade. The board members erupted into a chaotic chorus of protests and confused questions, but their voices faded into background noise as I watched the sinister choreography unfold right in front of me. Derek did not hesitate for a single second. He wiped a non-existent tear from his eye and reached across the table. He took the heavy gold pen Richard held out to him. With a few swift, eager strokes of the gold pen, Derek signed his name at the very bottom of the fraudulent medical conservatorship affidavit. Richard quickly stamped the document with his official notary seal. "Given the tragic and sudden nature of my father's condition," Derek announced, raising his voice to cut through the rising panic of the board members, "I am now legally acting as the sole conservator of his estate and the chief executive officer of Coal Freight. And it is my first official duty to make a deeply difficult but entirely necessary decision to secure the future of this failing enterprise." Right on cue, Gregory Pierce stood up from his chair in the shadowy corner. He walked with supreme arrogance, carrying a sleek black leather briefcase, snapping the metal latches open to proudly reveal the thick stack of hostile buyout contracts. The board members gasped. They recognized Pierce immediately. John Sterling, my oldest board member and trusted friend, slammed his fist onto the table. "Derek, what is the meaning of this? You cannot bring Apex into this house. Your father would rather burn this company to the ground than sell it to them." "My father is no longer capable of making rational decisions, John." Derek snapped back, his voice dripping with newfound arrogant authority. The company is drowning in hidden debts. I have negotiated a strategic buyout with Apex Logistics to save what little value remains. Mr. Pierce is here to finalize the acquisition right now. Derek reached his hand out, his trembling fingers eager to grasp the Apex contract. He picked up the gold pen once more. He hovered the tip over the signature line, a triumphant, greedy smile spreading across his sweating face. That was the exact moment I decided the play was completely over. I stopped shaking. The pathetic rhythmic tremor in my right hand vanished in a fraction of a second. I unhunched my shoulders, rolling my neck, until a loud, satisfying pop echoed from my spine. I planted my feet firmly on the floor and sat straight up in the heavy leather armchair. Derek did not notice right away, but Monica noticed. I saw her dark eyes widen in sudden sheer terror as she watched my posture transform from a crumpled leaf into a solid wall of stone. I reached out with a steady, powerful grip and picked up the ceramic coffee mug resting in front of me. I tightened my fingers around the handle, lifted it high into the air, and hurled it with every single ounce of strength I possessed directly at the wall behind Derek. The heavy ceramic shattered against the expensive wood paneling with the explosive force of a gunshot. Dark coffee and jagged white shards exploded outward, raining down across the polished floor and scattering violently over Richard Lawson's pristine legal documents. The loud crash acted like a physical shockwave. The entire room fell instantly, terrifyingly silent. The board members stared at me with their mouths hanging open in absolute shock. Derek dropped the gold pen. It clattered against the table, rolling away as he slowly turned his head to look at me, his face draining of all its color. Richard Lawson completely froze in place, his shaking hands hovering uselessly over his ruined, completely stained paperwork. I looked directly at Monica, who was gripping the arms of her chair so tightly her knuckles were completely white. I let a cold, ruthless smile spread across my face. "Did you really think I would drink your poison twice?" I asked. My voice did not tremble. It did not slur. It boomed across the grand dining room, carrying the deep, thunderous resonance of a man who had commanded freight yards and broken strikes for 4 decades. I spat it into my flask. I reached inside my tailored suit jacket and pulled out a small silver pocket flask. I tossed it onto the center of the mahogany table. It landed with a heavy thud, spinning slowly until it came to a complete stop, pointing directly at my terrified son. It is amazing what you can fake when you know exactly what the audience is desperately waiting to see. I continued pushing myself up from the armchair. My legs were perfectly steady. I stood at my full height, towering over the end of the table. You wanted a helpless, dying old man. You wanted a tragedy to mask your pathetic, cowardly theft. But all you got was just me. Derek opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked like a fish suffocating on dry land. He looked down at the medical conservatorship he had just signed, realizing the massive legal trap he had just foolishly activated. I did not give any of them the chance to recover from the shock. I walked with slow, purposeful strides away from the table. I moved past the stunned board members, ignoring their bewildered whispers as they watched me walk with absolute authority. I walked straight to the massive double oak doors that served as the only exit from the grand dining room. I grabbed the heavy brass keys resting in the lock. With a loud, definitive click that echoed sharply through the silent room, I turned the deadbolt. I turned around, leaning my broad back against the locked wooden doors, trapping every single person inside. "Nobody is leaving this room right now," I announced, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy register. "The retirement party is officially canceled. Now we are going to have a real board meeting." I walked back to the head of the table, my footsteps echoing with absolute authority. Reaching beneath the polished mahogany, I pressed a concealed button. The heavy velvet curtains slid shut, plunging the room into shadows. A large projection screen lowered smoothly from the ceiling behind my chair. I pulled my encrypted laptop from my jacket pocket, set it on the table, and plugged in the display cable. The bright blue projector light illuminated the horrified faces of my board members. You were all brought here today under the guise of witnessing my tragic medical decline. I began, my voice ringing clear and steady. My son and my trusted lawyer painted a picture of a broken man desperate to hand over the reins before his mind completely failed him. But I am not losing my mind. I am simply hunting rats. I pressed the spacebar. The security camera footage filled the massive screen. The board watched in stunned silence as the video showed Monica standing by the marble island. They saw her look over her shoulder to ensure she was alone. They watched as she pulled the foil blister pack from her pocket, crushed the heavy sedatives with a metal spoon, and stirred the toxic powder directly into my black coffee. A collective gasp ripped through the dining room. Several board members pushed their chairs back in sheer disgust. Monica shrank into her seat, wrapping her arms around her stomach, as if she had been physically struck. She opened her mouth to speak, but the crushing evidence choked the words right out of her throat. That was filmed yesterday morning, I stated coldly. A concentrated dose of benzodiazepine intended to induce severe tremors and cognitive failure. But she was not working alone. I clicked the next file. The audio recording from the second-floor hallway began to play. The voices of Derek and Monica echoed through the speakers. The board listened as Derek whined about the dosage, terrified of killing me before the papers were signed. They heard her vicious voice ordering him to stop being a coward. And then the most damning sentence rang out. He just needs to look completely lost and confused when Lawson brings out the papers. Lawson will handle the rest. Every head at the table snapped toward Richard Lawson. The esteemed corporate attorney visibly shrank in his chair. The blood drained from his face, leaving him a ghastly shade of white. He looked at the ruined medical conservatorship document covered in spilled coffee, realizing he had just stamped his official seal onto a criminal conspiracy. You drafted a fraudulent power of attorney, Richard Farce. I said, my tone devoid of any mercy. You sat at my table, you shook my hand, and then you conspired to lock me in a medical facility so my son could steal my entire legacy. I have already sent these recordings to the district attorney. You are going to federal prison. Lawson did not say a word. He slowly removed his silver glasses, his hands shaking violently, and buried his face in his palms. I turned my attention to the thick black binder resting next to my laptop. I picked it up and threw it down the length of the table. It slid across the polished wood, stopping right in front of John Sterling. Open it, John, I instructed. John flipped the heavy cover open. He stared at the summary page, his eyes widening in horror at the massive red numbers. Harrison, what is this? He asked, his voice trembling. $7.5 million. That is the gambling debt my son has secretly accumulated over the past 2 years, I announced to the room. He owes that money to a violent criminal syndicate. They gave him until the end of the month to pay, or they were going to kill him. He was not trying to take over Coal Freight to run it. He was trying to take it over so he could immediately liquidate it and save his own skin. I turned my gaze to the dark corner of the room, locking out their eyes with the man in the slate-gray suit. Gregory Pierce was no longer smiling. He was slowly reaching for the handle of his black leather briefcase, trying to make himself as small as possible. Stand up, Pierce, I commanded. The Apex Logistics executive slowly got to his feet, trying to maintain his corporate composure, but the sheer panic in his eyes betrayed him. My son agreed to sell my company to Apex for $9 million the second he got control, I told the board. Pierce came here today to sign the paperwork and fire every single one of our 450 employees. He came to gut our pension funds and destroy everything we built. I pointed my finger directly at the locked double doors. Pick up your briefcase and get out of my house, Pierce. If Apex ever contacts my company again, I will release the evidence of your backdoor dealings to the Federal Trade Commission and have your entire firm investigated for racketeering. Walk. Pierce did not utter a single word of defense. He grabbed his briefcase, scurried to the doors, and waited like a disciplined dog while I tossed him the brass key. He unlocked the door, slipped out into the hallway, and practically ran out of the mansion. I walked over and locked the doors once again. When I turned back to the table, Derek was on his hands and knees. He had crawled out of his chair and was sobbing uncontrollably on the ruined rug. Tears and snot streamed down his face. He reached out his soft, perfectly manicured hands, grabbing the cuffs of my trousers. "Dad, please," Derek begged, his voice a pathetic, high-pitched wail. "Please, they were going to kill me. I was desperate. I am so sorry. I did not want to do it. Monica forced me to. Please, Dad, you have to help me. I am your son." I looked down at the pathetic boy I had raised. I thought about the 40 years of sacrifice. I thought about the calloused hands and the sleepless nights. I felt absolutely nothing. No pity, no sorrow. Just a cold, empty void where my love for him used to be. I calmly reached down, firmly grabbed his shaking wrists, and forcefully peeled his hands off my clothes. I took a step back, looking down at him with eyes as cold as glacial ice. "You are not my son," I whispered. The heavy silence that followed my words was suddenly broken by a sharp, piercing sound echoing from the winding driveway outside. It started as a faint wail in the distance, but within seconds, the shrieking pitch of multiple police sirens tore through the quiet afternoon air. Red and blue lights began to flash frantically against the heavy velvet curtains I had drawn closed. Derek scrambled backward, his eyes darting frantically toward the windows. Monica let out a high-pitched gasp, covering her mouth with her trembling hands. I had called the local precinct exactly 15 minutes before I walked down that staircase. I did not just call in a domestic disturbance. I had Victor Carmichael personally deliver the digital copies of the hidden camera footage, the hallway audio recordings, and the forensic financial reports directly to the district attorney. The police did not come here today to ask polite questions. They came here to execute felony arrest warrants. Heavy, hurried footsteps echoed in the grand foyer. I had instructed Elena to wait by the front door and unlock it the moment she heard the sirens. The brass handles of the dining room doors rattled violently before I reached into my pocket, pulled out the key, and unlocked them from the inside. 4 uniformed police officers and 2 plainclothes detectives stormed into the room. The lead detective, a tall man with a stern, unforgiving face, scanned the panicked faces around the mahogany table before his eyes locked firmly onto Monica. "Monica Cole." The detective announced, his voice booming over the frightened murmurs of the board members. "You are under arrest for the attempted murder of Harrison Cole." 2 uniformed officers immediately marched around the table, grabbed Monica by the arms, and forcefully pulled her out of her chair. She screamed, thrashing wildly against their grip, her carefully constructed mask of innocence shattering into a million pathetic pieces. She begged Derek to help her, crying out that it was his idea. But Derek remained frozen on the floor, too terrified to even look in her direction. The sharp metallic click of the steel handcuffs locking around her delicate wrists was the most satisfying sound I had heard in years. The detective then turned his attention to the other end of the table. "Richard Lawson," he stated coldly. "You are under arrest for criminal conspiracy, attempted corporate fraud, and accessory to attempted murder." Richard did not fight back. The arrogant, untouchable corporate lawyer looked completely hollowed out. He slowly stood up, placed his hands behind his back, and allowed the officers to cuff him without a single word of protest. He knew his career, his reputation, and his freedom were permanently, completely destroyed. The officers marched them both out of the dining room, their shameful exit witnessed by the most powerful people in my company. When the heavy wooden doors swung shut behind the police, only Derek remained. He was still kneeling on the ruined rug, his chest heaving with frantic, desperate breaths. He looked up at me, a glimmer of pathetic, misguided hope flashing in his bloodshot eyes. He thought I had spared him. He thought that because the police had not placed him in handcuffs, my paternal instincts had somehow overridden my desire for absolute justice. He fundamentally misunderstood the nature of my vengeance. Prison would have been a profoundly merciful escape for him. In a sterile federal cell, he would be fed, clothed, and protected from the brutal consequences of his own disastrous choices. I was not going to give him that luxury. "Get up," I commanded, my voice echoing like a whip crack in the silent room. Derek scrambled to his feet, wiping the dirt and tears from his face. I turned to face the remaining board of directors. John Sterling and the others watched me with absolute, terrified respect. "I wanted all of you here today to serve as formal legal witnesses to this exact moment," I announced, projecting my voice clearly. "Effective immediately, I am formally and irrevocably disinheriting Derek Cole from my entire estate. He is no longer my beneficiary. He is no longer an employee of Cole Freight. He has absolutely no legal or financial claim to my company, my properties, or my legacy." Derek let out a choked, agonizing sob. "Dad, you cannot do this," he pleaded, taking a stumbling step toward me. "If you cut me off, I am dead. You know what those people will do to me." "Empty your pockets," I demanded, ignoring his pathetic whimpering. "Right now. Empty them onto the table." He hesitated for a fraction of a second, but the cold, unforgiving rage burning in my eyes forced him to obey. With trembling fingers, he reached into his expensive, tailored suit. He pulled out his thick leather wallet and tossed it onto the mahogany wood. He pulled out the heavy set of keys to the luxury sports car I had purchased for his last birthday. "Open the wallet," I instructed. "Take out every single credit card bearing my name or the company logo. Take out the corporate access badge." Derek wept openly as he slid the platinum cards and the security badge across the table. He was stripping away his own armor piece by piece, realizing exactly what I was leaving him with. I was leaving him with nothing but the expensive clothes on his back and a $7.5 million target painted squarely on his chest. "You wanted to sell my life to save yours," I said, stepping closer until I was mere inches from his terrified face. "You wanted to throw me into a cage while you spent my money. Now you get to walk out the front door of my house with absolutely nothing. No cars, no bank accounts, no protection. When the syndicate comes looking for their money tomorrow, you can try paying them with the fraudulent contract you signed today." "Get out of my house," I whispered. "Never, ever come back." Derek stared quietly at me for a long, agonizing moment. He desperately searched my eyes for any lingering trace of the loving father who had protected him his entire life, but he found nothing except a locked, impenetrable door. He turned around, his shoulders shaking, with silent sobs, and walked slowly out of the grand dining room. I listened to his heavy footsteps echo across the grand foyer, followed by the heavy thud of the front door closing forever. The silence that washed over the mansion was profound. It was not the cold, oppressive silence of a tomb anymore. It was the clear, breathable silence of a house that had finally been cleansed of its toxic burdens. I turned back to the remaining board members. They were still sitting around the mahogany table looking at me with a mixture of shock and deep reverence. I smoothed the lapels of my tailored suit and offered them a tired but genuine smile. "The crisis is over, my loyal friends," I told them gently. "Cole Freight is completely safe and the internal rot has been permanently cut out." I thanked them for their patience and asked them to return to their homes, to be with their loving families. Once the board members finally departed, I walked slowly down the quiet hall toward the staff quarters. I knocked softly on Elena's bedroom door. She slowly opened it a crack, her dark, tired eyes wide and incredibly fearful. I reached out and gently took her trembling hands in mine. "It is finally over, Elena," I said softly. "You are completely safe now." I walked her back into the main house. We sat down together in the large kitchen, just two old survivors catching our breath after a massive storm. "You saved my life, Elena," I told her sincerely. "You bravely risked absolutely everything to warn me, and I will never forget that remarkable loyalty. From this day forward, you are no longer the housekeeper of this estate. I am promoting you to the general manager of this entire large property. You will oversee the grounds, hire your own staff, and you will never scrub another floor as long as you live." I also had Victor Carmichael set up a private, irrevocable trust fund in your name. It has $2 million sitting in it, completely tax-free and secure. It is your retirement, Elena. You earned every single penny by being the only honest person in a house full of venomous snakes. She wept freely, but this time they were tears of absolute joy and relief. Exactly 3 days later, I sat comfortably in my private study with Victor Carmichael. The ruined documents from Richard Lawson had been thrown into the fireplace and burned to gray ash. In their place sat a pristine stack of legally binding contracts drafted by Victor's prestigious firm. This was the real succession plan. I picked up my heavy gold pen and signed my name on the bottom line. I did not feel a single tremor in my hand. With those few strong signatures, I officially transferred 100% of the shares of Cole Freight into an employee stock ownership plan. I gave the entire $42 million logistics empire directly to the 450 loyal drivers, mechanics, dispatchers, and warehouse workers who had shed their own blood, sweat, and tears to build it right alongside me. Arthur, the lead mechanic, would now own a piece of the very same garage he ran. Maria, the dedicated night shift dispatcher, would have her children's college tuition guaranteed by the company's robust annual dividends. They were my true family. They had stood firmly by me through the brutal freight wars, the crippling economic recessions, and the long, sleepless nights on the highway. They deserved the kingdom far more than the spoiled, treacherous, and ungrateful prince who had so foolishly tried to steal it. Right now, I am sitting peacefully on the back wooden porch of my quiet home. The morning sun is just beginning to rise over the distant tree line, casting a bright, warm, golden glow across the manicured green lawn. The air is crisp and wonderfully clean. Elena just brought me a fresh cup of coffee. It is a dark roast, completely black, and it is the very best thing I have ever tasted. I sip the hot liquid and look out at the beautiful horizon, feeling a profound sense of peace settling deep into my old bones. People often say that blood is thicker than water. They loudly insist that family is absolutely everything, and that you must always forgive the people who share your last name no matter how terribly they treat you in the dark. I learned the hard way that blood is absolutely nothing without loyalty, respect, and unwavering honor. Sometimes the family you are born into is nothing more than a tragic biological accident. The family you choose to build, the people who stand courageously by you when the terrifying shadows fall, those are the ones who truly matter in this world. I lost my only son to his own blinding greed, but I secured the bright future for hundreds of hardworking sons and daughters who actually deserve it. I survived the ultimate trap, and I walked away from the wreckage stronger than ever before. If my personal story resonated deeply with you, if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who completely underestimated your worth, please hit the like button now and formally subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment down below and let me know exactly where you are watching from and what time it is there right now. Your wonderful support means the world to me, and it helps bring these powerful stories to others who might urgently need the courage to fight back. Always stay strong, firmly protect your precious peace, and never let anyone steal your dignity. Thank you so much for listening.